quick stop. Part 1, his side of the story. He was running so fast he almost couldn't breathe. His lungs were burning and he knew his legs were about to give out. The only thing that kept him moving was the knowledge that if he stopped, he was dead. The night had started with what he believed was the same inevitable ending of every other night of his life. He would get off work at 2 a.m., drive through the local fast food joint for dinner he would later regret, and watch TV shows recorded on his cable box. He would be alone, and he used to believe that this was a horrible fate. Now, as he ran, for the first time, he would have preferred to be alone on his couch. 3 days earlier, he should have known she was too good to be true. The first time he saw her, he thought she looked like a pixie. About 5'6", she was slight of frame and pale skin. She wore tight jeans that rested on her hips and a small black tank top that didn't quite reach her navel. He could tell she wasn't wearing a bra, but she was perky and firm enough to pull it off. He felt very lucky the counter that he stood behind was waist high. He watched as she moved in and out of the aisles, and he couldn't tell if she was wondering or looking for something in particular. Terror and embarrassment held him back from just asking. He was staring when she approached the counter, a smile playing across her features. He met her gaze and saw that she had full pouty lips, light freckles, and a small upturned nose. It was her eyes that grabbed him, though, violet, encircled with a silvery gray. He realized that his mouth was hanging open when she giggled. He tried to compose himself by clearing his throat and scanning her items, placing them hastily in a bag. "Hi," she said, smiling again and breaking the awkward silence. Hi. Welcome to Quick Stop. Will this be all for this evening?" he replied, reciting the same line he had said for 3 years. "Yes, Jimmy. That will be all for this evening," she said, looking at his name tag for a moment, then back up to his face as she handed him a 20. He wanted to hear her say his name again. He looked away. He couldn't seem to focus and didn't want to make a bigger idiot of himself by not being able to count out simple change. He tore the receipt from the register, counted back her change to her, and only when finished did he make eye contact again. "Thanks, Jimmy. See you around," she said, and left. He sighed. He knew he wouldn't see her again. Most of the customers were locals or long-haul truckers. Chicken farms and packing plants surrounded the small community of Clovertop, Kansas, and that was where most of the jobs were. The lucky ones like himself worked at the gas stations or restaurants located off the highway exit that ran through town. There was a small motel across the street behind the breakfast barn with only 12 rooms. It wasn't a place where anyone stayed long. He finished his shift and went about his normal nightly routine. He was surprised the next night when the pixie returned. She wandered again, picking items here and there, and approached the counter. She was dressed very similarly to the night before, but he noticed scratches on her left forearm. "Hi, Jimmy. How are you tonight?" she said with a smile. "Don't stare at her," he repeated to himself. "I'm good, thanks," he said, and began to ring up her order. Garbage bags, duct tape, cheese poops, and an amp-me-up energy drink. "Wild night?" he asked as he loaded the items into the bag. "You could say that," she said, her hand brushed against his when she grabbed the bag. He jerked away startled, and then she laughed. He hoped it wasn't at him, but he took her cash and made change. This time he handed it back to her without counting it. "Thanks again, Jimmy. See you around," she said, and again she left. When the door had closed, his head fell into his hands. He was a total idiot. With the moronic moment being the peak of his day, the rest of his evening ended uneventfully. The following morning he woke up and vowed to ask the pixie her name if she came in again. If he felt brave enough, he would even ask her why she was in town. Before work that third day, he showered, brushed his teeth, combed his hair, and picked out the cleanest and nicest jeans and shirt he owned. At the Quick Stop, the clock seemed to drag forever. He was trying to ring up a family, obviously on a road trip, with 4 children under 10 years old from the looks of them. The kids were cranky and having problems deciding what they wanted. He didn't envy the parents. He almost missed the pixie when she walked in, but she was simply mesmerizing each time he laid eyes on her. She began the normal stroll through the racks of snacks. He finally was able to bring up the herd, and she approached the counter. He blurted out, "What is your name?" And he hoped to be more eloquent, but at least he had asked her, he thought to himself. She smiled and tilted her head. "My name is Willow." He rang up her items with a satisfied smile on his face. "Jimmy, do you want to hang out later?" Willow asked as he was handing her back her change. He froze. That was the first time a girl had asked him out, and he was at a total loss. Ignoring his silence, she said, "Well, if you want to, hang out, that is. Pick me up after your shift. I'm in room 6 at the motel." She grabbed the bag off the counter. He nodded, still unable to speak. "Thanks again, Jimmy. See you soon." She winked at him as she left. Part 2. Her side of the story. She couldn't remember the last time she woke up and knew what the name of the town or city she was in. Everything had changed the year before when Thorne had gotten sick. Sometimes she wondered if the method of keeping him alive was worth the cost. There had to be a cure. She couldn't lose him. They arrived in Clovertop to simply fill up and move on. Unusually smaller towns weren't able to provide what Thorne needed. She was filling up the tank on the truck when the bed moved. Thorne was awake. Since it wasn't nighttime, she didn't know how that was possible unless he sensed food. She looked around at the depressing excuse for what used to be called a town. It was nothing but gray, and she couldn't imagine what he sensed, maybe a traveler like themselves. But then she saw it, a faint wisp leading into the store in front of her. She looked at the sign, the Quick Stop. Closing her eyes, she took a deep breath and looked at the people in the store. It was strong. The spirit emanating the mist was not in the store then, but was there regularly. She could sense it all around. She would wait. The truck bed moved again as Thorne struggled against his confinement. It had been too long since he'd eaten. She spotted a motel across the street and headed across to get a room. The distance from the motel to the Quick Stop was enough that if Thorne was sensing the spirit, she couldn't tell. As she sat with him and waited, wanting to be sure of her perceptions, he seemed dormant again, so she headed back across the street. When she walked in, she could feel it all around her, caressing her skin as if it was a warm bath. She looked around and found the source. Behind the counter stood a clerk, and he was staring at her. She looked away, not wanting to seem obvious, and gathered up supplies she would need for the night. As she approached the counter, she studied her find. Nothing if not ordinary. He was average height with an average build. His short brown hair and brown eyes would never set him apart. He looked about 20 years old, but she had to be sure that he was what he appeared. She couldn't afford to make another mistake. It would take 3 turns of the sun to know for sure, and he was worth it. When she returned to the room, she saw Thorne had whipped himself into a frenzy. 3 nights, she told him, and forced him into the quiet. She began to spell that name, taking each layer apart. It took time and most of her power. She was exhausted each night when Jimmy showed up for work. Thorne became worse. She had to resort to locking him in the bathroom. On the last night, she was as sure she could be. She took Thorne to a clearing in the woods behind the motel. She bound him enough that he wouldn't be able to wander, but not enough to keep him contained once he caught the scent. She went to the Quick Stop, and Jimmy asked her name. She willingly gave it. He didn't know how to use it to hurt her, and soon enough it wouldn't matter. She invited him out with a little word of suggestion and knew he would arrive. She opened the door before he even had a chance to knock. He seemed surprised, even more so when she planted a soft kiss on his lips. He smiled euphorically, and then she pulled away. She took his hand in hers and led him down behind the building. Jimmy was happier than he would ever be in his life. Her kiss had ensured that. She couldn't change what was about to happen, but she could give him that. As she neared the clearing, she heard the sounds of Thorne's bonds tearing. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Jimmy's smiling face, and then was gone. Jimmy found himself standing alone in the clearing behind the motel, and he looked around confused. "Willow, where did you go?" he called, and heard a noise crash through the trees in front of him. A creature emerged. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Its skin was a sickly green where it wasn't falling off the bone, and the sunken eye sockets were yellow globes where eyes should have been. When it opened its mouth, sharp broken teeth lined its gums, and it made a noise akin to a scream. Then the stench hit Jimmy. All he could think was run. As he tore through the trees, he didn't look back. Jimmy could hear it breathing behind him. "Keep running," he repeated to himself. His lungs were burning and his legs were growing numb when the worst happened. His foot snagged on a tree root and he tumbled to the ground. Within seconds, the creature was on him, tearing at his chest. He closed his eyes. He could scream, but he knew no one would hear, and it wouldn't change what was about to happen. Jimmy focused on the tingling on his lips and the memory of her kiss. It only hurt for a moment when his rib cage was ripped open and his heart was yanked from his chest. Willow sat on a branch, watching the scene unfold beneath her. She floated to the ground as Thorne drank in the essence from the flesh he now held. Jimmy's innocence fed the stricken Fay, and for a minute, Thorne's gray-green eyes met hers.
Erika is attendance. Okay, so back next month and finish reading.
There was one last sentence.
Oh, go ahead.
You guys want it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. She smiled and gently caressed his cheek. He raised his blood-coated hand to hers and closed his eyes.
Sorry.